What would you do if the year took everything from you? Your herd, your ranch, and the woman who slept beside you. And then, at the far end of that ruin, a stranger slid a deed across a plank counter and asked you for $2. George Walker, 45 years old, saddle-sore and half-frozen, paid the coins from a pocket that held little else and rode out to a homestead nobody else in Pine Run would touch. They laughed at him for it. They said the place was cursed, or worthless, or both. But what waited inside those weathered logs would rewrite everything he thought he had lost. Settle in, stay close, and let us know where you're watching from tonight, because this story turns slow, and it turns hard. The road into Pine Run in late November was more rut than road, and the wind coming down off the ridge had teeth in it. George rode a dun gelding named Ash, the last animal left to him after the auctioneer's hammer had finished its long, slow work of erasing his life. His duster was faded at the shoulders, where the sun had chewed it thin over 10 summers, and his hat brim carried a permanent bend from being pulled low against too many storms. He did not look at the town as he entered it. He looked at Ash's ears, at the frozen mud, at the smoke lifting crooked from a stovepipe over the mercantile roof. He had not meant to come back to Pine Run. He had meant to keep riding, north maybe, until the country ran out, or he did. But the notice tacked to a post outside a rail depot 2 towns back had stopped him cold. A homestead parcel, 160 acres, cabin standing, water on the property, opening bid $2, no reserve. The name of the town beneath it had been Pine Run, and something in him, the same stubborn thing that had kept him on his own land 3 seasons past, when any sensible man would have walked away, had turned Ash's head south. He had lost the herd first. 230 head of cattle, most of them bought on paper, all of them killed by a winter that came early and stayed late and left the drifts stacked halfway up the barn door. He had walked the pasture in April, counting frozen shapes under the melt, and stopped counting at 90. He had lost the ranch second, in a bank office in a town whose name he no longer said aloud, a clerk sliding papers across a desk with the practiced softness of a man who had done this to 100 others. And he had lost his wife third, though third was not the right word, because Mary had already been leaving for a long time before she finally went. She had left a note on the kitchen table folded once. He had not opened it for 2 days. When he did, it said only that she was sorry, and that she had gone to her sister's, and that he was not to come after her. He had not. Pine Run, in the failing light, looked much as he remembered it from a cattle drive he had passed through a decade before. A plank saloon, a livery, a mercantile with a warped porch, a churchyard set on a rise at the edge of nothing. A few faces turned as he passed. He touched his hat brim and rode on to the land office, which was a single room set behind the mercantile with a stove barely warmer than the street. The clerk inside was a narrow man with ink-stained cuffs, who looked at George the way a man looks at weather he cannot change. "You hear about the $2 parcel," the clerk said. "I am," George answered. The clerk almost smiled. Almost. He pulled a ledger out from under the counter and turned it around, and he set a nib pen beside it, and he waited. George laid $2 silver on the plank. They rang once and settled. The clerk's pen scratched. "Homestead at the north bend of the creek, half-mile past the old chapel road. You'll know it by the caved roof on the shed." "Anyone living out there?" George asked. "No one has lived out there in 11 years, the clerk said. He paused. No one who stayed. He turned the ledger for George to sign. George signed. The clerk blotted the ink and slid a folded deed across the counter, and as George took it, The clerk finally allowed himself the small, tight smile he had been holding back. "Mr. Walker," he said, "you are the first man to bid on that ground since the county put it up. Every other man in this town has laughed at that notice for 6 years. You understand what that means." "I understand what it means to me," George said. He tucked the deed inside his coat and stepped back out into the wind. Word of the transaction moved faster than he did. By the time he had walked Ash across the street to the livery to arrange a stall for the night, 3 men on the saloon porch were already watching him, with the loose grins of men warming to a story. One of them, a broad man in a fine wool coat with a heavy silver watch chain looped across his vest, leaned on the rail and called out. $2, the man said. $2 whole dollars. You must be flush, cowboy." George did not turn. "You know what's out there," the man went on, louder. "You know why nobody's touched that ground. That cabin is a coffin with a door on it. You just bought yourself a place to freeze." George handed the livery boy a coin and murmured instructions about grain and water, and he ran a slow hand down Ash's neck, and he did not answer. Behind him, the laughter on the saloon porch swelled and then thinned, the way laughter does when it fails to catch on the thing it was aimed at. An old woman in a black shawl stood at the edge of the porch, watching. She did not laugh. Her eyes tracked George the way a person tracks something remembered from a long time ago. He did not see her yet. Why would a man who had lost everything spend his last 2 silver dollars on a cabin the whole town called a coffin? What did the county know about that ground that made them ask so little for it? And what, in 11 years of emptiness, had been waiting inside those weathered logs for someone stubborn enough to come? If this story is pulling at you already, drop a comment below and tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe so you can ride the rest of the road with George. Because tomorrow at dawn, he saddles Ash and rides out to see what $2 really bought him. That night, George took a cot at the back of the livery for another coin, because the boarding house was full and because he wanted to be near Ash. He ate cold biscuit and a strip of salted beef from his saddlebag and drank water from the pump behind the stable. The wind moved through the plank walls in low seams. He lay in the dark with his hat over his face and listened to Ash shift in the next stall. And he thought about the folded deed inside his coat. And he thought about Mary's note folded once on the kitchen table. And he did not sleep for a long while. In the morning, before the sun had cleared the ridge, he walked over to the mercantile to lay in what he could afford. He bought a sack of flour, a small tin of coffee, a slab of bacon wrapped in brown paper, a box of matches, a coil of new rope, a half-pound of nails, and a can of coal oil for a lantern he did not yet own. The mercantile keeper counted his coins twice and slid them into a drawer without meeting his eyes. 2 younger men leaning near the barrel of pickles watched him and grinned at each other. One of them said something low, the other laughed. George paid them no mind. Out on the warped porch, he shifted the sack of flour up onto his shoulder and stopped. The old woman in the black shawl was standing at the porch rail. Up close, she was smaller than she had seemed from a distance, and older, her hands folded neatly at her waist. Her eyes were the pale gray of creek water in winter. She looked at George the way a person looks at a letter she has been carrying for a long time. "Mr. Walker," she said. George touched the brim of his hat. "You bought the North Bend," she said. It was not a question. "I did," George said. She was quiet for a long moment. The wind lifted the fringe of her shawl and set it down again. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and stopped. "The ground remembers who was kind to it," she said. George waited for her to say more. She did not. She looked at him a beat longer, as though measuring something in his face against something she already knew. And then she nodded once, small and formal, and turned and walked back toward the church road with a slow, even step. He watched her go. He did not know what she meant. He filed the sentence away the way a man files a strange coin he has been handed on the road, not sure yet whether it will spend. He was tying the last of his goods behind Ash's saddle when the broad man from the saloon porch came across the street, boots loud on the boards, coat unbuttoned in the cold, as if to show the watch chain off. He stopped a few feet from Ash and looked George up and down. "Name's Boyd Harmon," the broad man said. "I run the freight yard and the feedlot. I own most of the West End. You listening, cowboy?" "I hear you," George said. "That land you bought is nothing," Harmon said. "I offered the county $50 for the whole parcel 4 years back. They wouldn't sell to me, wouldn't sell to nobody. Then they put it up at $2, and everybody in this town laughed because everybody in this town knows. And here you come. Some broke drifter on a spent horse. $2. He shook his head, smiling without any warmth in it. "You'll be back inside a month. When you are, I'll take it off you for $1. George drew the last knot on the rope tight and tested it with a tug. He put his gloved hand on Ash's shoulder. "I'll manage," George said. Harmon barked a short laugh and turned away and went back across the street, shaking his head, as if he had witnessed something remarkable and stupid at once. George swung up into the saddle. The mercantile keeper watched him from behind the warped glass. 2 boys in the alley beside the livery watched him. He turned Ash north. The chapel road ran up out of Pine Run, along a low grade, lined with black pines, still holding a light dust of the last snow. The sky above the ridge was the color of old tin. George rode with the reins loose in his hand and let Ash pick the pace. Half a mile past the church, the road narrowed to a track, and half a mile past that, the track dropped into a shallow valley he did not remember from the drive 10 years ago. A creek ran along the far side of the bottom, black and slow between banks of pale stone. He heard it before he saw it. The homestead sat in the crook where the creek bent hard to the east. He drew Ash up on the rise above it and looked down. The cabin was smaller than he had expected. 2 rooms at most, low walls of squared logs gone silver with weather, a roof of split shakes that dipped in the middle where a rafter had given way. A stone chimney climbed the north wall and leaned. The shed the clerk had spoken of stood 20 paces off, its roof caved clean through. One wall bellied out into the yard. A pole corral behind it had collapsed on itself in 3 places. Grass and thin brush had come up through everything. A single tall pine stood at the corner of the cabin, older than the buildings by 100 years. He sat a long time in the saddle looking at it. He had known it would be poor. $2 is $2, but knowing a thing and seeing it are different sizes. He rode down. The door of the cabin hung on one hinge and stood a hand's width open. He tied Ash to the pine and pushed the door back with his palm. It scraped a quarter circle in the dirt of the floor and stopped. He ducked under the low header and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Old ash from a cold hearth, mouse, damp wood, and under all of it a faint, sweet trace like cured grass that had never quite left. A single room, longer than it was wide, with a loft above the far end, reached by a plank ladder nailed to the wall. A stone fireplace on the north side, a rough table shoved against one wall, one leg propped on a piece of firewood, a tin cup on the table, dry, upright, patient. 2 windows, one shuttered, one broken. Wind moved through the room in a low, steady breath. He stood a long while in the middle of the floor. He set the sack of flour down against the wall. He set the coffee beside it. He set the coil of rope on the table next to the tin cup. "All right," he murmured. Ash whickered outside once, soft, as if in answer. He worked until dusk without stopping. He cleared the worst of the leaves and mouse leavings from the floor with a broken branch tied into a broom. He pulled the shutter free of the sound window and propped it in the frame so it would close. He gathered stones from the creek bank and stacked them against the base of the leaning chimney to steady it for the night. He led Ash into the ruin of the shed, chose the corner where the wall still held true, and rigged a rope line and a canvas half roof from his saddle blanket and a length of oilcloth so the gelding had shelter from the wind. He carried an armload of dry pine needles inside and made a bed of them against the hearth wall and laid his bedroll over the top. By the time the light went blue in the valley, he had a small fire going in the stone hearth. The chimney drew, badly at first, and then better, and the smoke found its way up and out. He set water on to boil in a battered pan he found hanging from a nail beside the fireplace. He crouched on his heels and watched the flames find their footing. He did not eat much. He was too tired to be hungry. He sat with his back against the log wall and let the heat work into his hands. Outside, the wind rose and settled, and the creek ran black past the yard, and Ash breathed evenly in the shed. The cabin around him creaked as the cold set into its bones. He listened. He listened for a long time. The wind in the pine at the corner of the cabin made one sound. The wind in the roof shakes made another. The wind coming down the flue over the low fire made a third. Under all of them, somewhere between the walls or under the floor or inside his own tired head, he thought he heard a fourth sound, a slow, uneven ticking, faint, patient, like a clock that had been running in an empty room for a very long time. He told himself it was the timbers cooling. He pulled his blanket up over his shoulder. He closed his eyes. The ticking did not stop. He woke once in the deep hour before dawn, and the ticking was still there. And then he woke again in gray light, and it was gone. He lay a moment on the pine needles, listening to the fire spit its last coal into ash. The sound might have been mice in the chinking. The sound might have been a beetle in the loft beam. The sound might have been nothing at all. He rose stiffly, pulled his boots on, and stepped outside into a cold that made his breath stand in the air like a plume of pipe smoke. Ash was awake in the shed corner with his head low and his ears turned forward, not back toward the trees or sideways toward the creek, but forward at the cabin wall. George noted it and did not think much of it. He filled the battered pan at the creek and set it on the fire and made coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. He drank it black beside the hearth. Then he began to look at his house. By daylight, the cabin showed its bones. The logs were squared oak, not pine, which was strange for a country of pine, and the corners had been notched with a patience George had not seen since his father's time. Whoever had put this cabin up had meant it to last 100 years. The roof shakes were split cedar. The stone chimney, leaning as it was, had been laid without mortar in the old way. Each rock chosen for a place it fit, and no other. A man in a hurry did not build this. A man passing through did not build this. A man had built this the way a man builds a thing he means to die in. That was the first small thing that would not sit right in George's mind. The second came when he crossed to the far wall to see about the loft ladder. Above the ladder, in the shadow where the loft floor met the log wall, a beam ran that did not match the others. The rest of the ceiling joists were oak like the walls, dark with age, hand-hewn on 4 faces. This one beam was pine, paler, newer by some years, and set slightly higher than the joists beside it, as if it had been added after, and not to hold weight, but to hide the gap it left below. George stood under it, with his coffee cooling in his hand, and studied it. He did not climb up. He did not pry at it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a track in soft ground when he is not yet sure what animal made it. He drank the last of his coffee and went back to work outside. The third small thing he found before the sun cleared the ridge. On the doorframe, at the height of a grown man's chest, on the inside face where the door swung shut against it, a letter had been cut into the wood. Not a full name, just an S, and beside it a small mark like a horseshoe laid on its side. The cut was old. The wood around it had gone silver the way the logs had gone silver. Someone had stood inside this door and taken a knife to the frame in a slow and deliberate hand, and left this and nothing else. George ran his thumb over the cut. He did not know an S. He knew no one at all attached to this ground. He set his hand flat against the doorframe for a moment, as a man will set his hand on a stone at a grave, and then he stepped out into the cold to see what else his $2 had bought him. He did not act on any of it. He filed each small wrongness away behind his eyes the way a rancher files the look of a sick calf, and he went to the work in front of him, because the work in front of him was what would keep him alive through the coming week. He started with the roof. He climbed up on the low side where the pitch was gentlest and worked along the ridge, pulling free the split shakes that had rotted through and stacking the sound ones in a pile on the ground. Where the rafter had given way at the middle, he cut a length of pine from a windfall behind the shed, dragged it in with Ash's help and a loop of the new rope, and worked it up into place. He did not have a proper sawmill board, and he did not have proper spikes, but he had the half-pound of nails from the mercantile and a hatchet from his saddlebag, and by noon he had the ridgeline holding and the worst of the shakes back in something like a row. He came down off the roof with his shoulders burning and stood in the yard and looked at the cabin. And the cabin, for the first time, looked back at him like a thing that might yet be a house. He led Ash to water at the creek and let the gelding drink. The creek stones under the bank were pale gray, flat, the size of a man's palm, and stacked in places by the current into small, careful piles that the current had not made. George noticed this and set the noticing beside the beam and the letter and the horseshoe mark and said nothing. That afternoon he worked on the chimney. He took down the leaning courses one stone at a time, laid them out in the yard in the order he had pulled them, and began setting them back with fresh creek mud packed between. His hands went red and then numb and then red again. Ash stood 10 paces off with his head down, one hip cocked, watching. Twice the gelding walked in closer, put his nose to George's shoulder, breathed hot against his neck, and drifted back. George rested his hand on Ash's jaw each time and went back to the stones. Halfway down the second course, he lifted a wide, flat stone from near the base of the chimney and found, cut into the underside of it where no weather could have touched it, the same small horseshoe mark from the doorframe. Just the mark. No letter this time. He turned the stone in his hands. He looked at the mark for a long minute. Then he set the stone back into its place with the mark hidden against the mud, exactly as the builder had set it, and went on with the work. By the time the light thinned toward evening, the chimney stood straight, the roof held, the shutter closed against the sound window, and the door swung true on both hinges because George had cut a peg from oak scrap and driven it through the broken one. He was bone-tired. His hands were split at the knuckles. He was warm in a way he had not been warm in a year, the warmth that comes not from a fire, but from having laid a thing right that was crooked when you found it. He fed Ash a double handful of grain from the mercantile sack and stood a long while with his forehead against the gelding's cheek. Ash breathed slow. George breathed slow. The valley went blue around them. Inside, he lit the small coal oil lantern he had bought and hung it from the same nail that held the pan. The light steadied. The shadows in the corners drew back. He sat down at the propped table with the tin cup in front of him and looked up at the pale beam in the ceiling that did not match. And he thought about the letter on the doorframe, and he thought about the horseshoe on the underside of the stone. He thought, whoever built this place built it around something. Outside, from the direction of the creek, an owl called once and did not call again. The lantern flame held, and somewhere, very faint, in the walls or under the floor, or in the tired quiet of his own head, the slow patient ticking began once more. He slept badly and rose in the dark, and the ticking was still there. He did not lie to himself about it a second night. He built the fire up, boiled a fresh pan of water, poured it into the tin cup, and stood beneath the pale pine beam holding the lantern up to the ceiling. The beam was set an inch proud of the joists on either side, as he had known. What he had not seen the day before, because he had been looking at the beam and not past it, was that the two planks laid above it, forming a small square of the loft floor, were shorter than the planks around them and pegged rather than nailed. A man building honest would have run them full length. A man hiding something would have cut them short. George climbed the plank ladder with the lantern in one hand and the hatchet in the other. He knelt on the loft boards. He set the lantern down and worked the point of the hatchet under the edge of the first short plank and lifted. The peg gave with a small dry sound like a cricket. He lifted the second. Beneath them was a shallow cavity between the beam and the ceiling planks, no deeper than a man's forearm, lined with dry cedar shavings the color of old honey. In the cavity lay a flat tin box the size of a Bible, and beside the tin, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with years, a leather-bound ledger, and beside the ledger a horseshoe rasp with a wooden handle worn smooth as riverstone. George brought all three down and laid them on the table under the lantern. He opened the tin first because it was smallest. Inside were letters folded in careful thirds, a lock of dark hair tied with a bit of twine, and a hand-drawn map on brown paper. The map showed the valley he sat in, the creek, the cabin, the pine at the corner, and drawn as small, careful circles, a scatter of stone cairns along the near bank of the creek and up into the pasture behind the shed. At the head of the northernmost cairn, a small crosshatch was inked, and beneath it, in a spare hand, the words, "Warm water, sweet grass, never freezes." George set the map down slowly. He opened the ledger next. It was a Homestead book, the way men used to keep them. Dates in one column, weather in the second, stock in the third, notes in the fourth. The first entry was dated April of a year long before he had first ridden this country. The hand belonged to a man who signed himself only as Sam and used at the end of each page the small mark of a horseshoe laid on its side, exactly as on the doorframe and the underside of the chimney stone. Sam had built the cabin with squared oak. Sam had run 12 head through a winter in which the county lost half its stock, and the ledger said why in 3 plain words: "Creek stays open." Later entries named a wife, Anna, who wrote in a rounder hand about a garden and a boy born in the loft in a February blizzard. Later still the writing changed. Anna's hand stopped. Sam's hand grew shorter, then stopped too. The last entry was a single line: "Buried her under the pine." George laid his hand flat on the page. He understood then, in the slow way a man understands a thing he has been living inside without seeing, that the ground under his boots did not freeze the way other ground froze. He understood that the smell of cured grass in the cabin, in November, when there should have been no grass anywhere, was because the pasture behind the shed was still green under the light snow. He understood the careful cairns along the creek, and the stones stacked so the current had not made them, and why the clerk had said no one who stayed. He understood why the county had refused Boyd Harmon at $50 4 years ago and put the parcel up at $2. There had been a family on this ground. The family had a name. The county had waited the years the law required for that name to be answered, and when no one came, they had let the ground go for the price of ink and a signature, because whoever bought it would have to earn what was under it. George closed the ledger. He sat a long while with his hand on the cover. Then he said quietly to the empty room, "I'll keep it." Outside, ash blew once in the shed. The lantern flame held. The ticking, when George listened for it, was only the timbers cooling after all, or perhaps it had never been anything else, and he had been the room the sound was empty in. The storm came 3 nights later. It came the way bad storms come in that country, without much warning and with a wind that shifted twice before it settled from the north. George felt it in the pine at the corner of the cabin first, then in Ash, who stood tight to the shed wall with his ears flat, and then in the light itself, which went from gray to the color of old tin in the space of an hour. By dusk, the snow was moving sideways across the yard, and the creek was a black seam in white. George banked the fire, brought Ash into the cabin itself because the shed would not hold, laid straw on the dirt floor in the corner farthest from the hearth, and tied a length of the new rope from the door latch to the pine outside so a man could find his way back if he had to step out. He heard them before he saw them. A voice under the wind, thin, calling, and a second voice, higher, a child's. George pulled on his coat and went out along the rope. They were 50 paces past the pine. A man leading a played-out mare and a woman on the mare's back with a bundle wrapped tight against her chest. The man's face was gray with cold. He had missed the chapel road in the storm and taken the track by mistake, thinking it led back to town. He said his wife could not feel her feet. He said the child was 2 years old. He did not say, "Please." He did not have to. George took the mare's bridle and led them in. Inside the cabin, he set the woman by the hearth and unwrapped the bundle himself because her hands would not work. The child was breathing. He built the fire higher. He put the man to rubbing the woman's feet through her stockings and would not let him stop. He heated water and pressed a warm tin cup into the woman's hands and closed her fingers around it. He put Ash's blanket over her shoulders. He fetched, from the creek where the cairn stood, and the water ran black and unfrozen even in the teeth of the wind, a second pan of water that steamed faintly in the lantern light on its way through the door, and he did not explain to the man why the creek was open, only set the pan on the fire and told him to keep drinking warm water into his wife until the color came back to her face. The storm ran 2 days. The child slept against his mother in a nest of pine needles and Ash's blanket. The man slept, sitting up against the wall, and woke every hour to feed the fire. George did not sleep much. He sat at the table with the ledger closed under his hand and watched the 3 of them breathe, and he thought that a man who had lost a herd and a ranch and a wife in 1 year had, by some accounting he did not yet understand, been given a house in time to put in it the people who would otherwise have died on the track outside. On the second night, when the wind finally dropped and the cabin was quiet except for the fire, the woman opened her eyes and looked at him across the room and said, "Thank you, mister." George said, "Sleep." She slept. On the third morning, the sky came up clean and hard and blue over the ridge, and the valley lay under a foot of new snow that softened every broken line of the yard into something almost whole. The man went out with George at first light and dug a path from the door to the shed and from the shed to the pine. And they brought the played-out mare in beside Ash under the half-roof George had patched with fresh oilcloth the week before. The woman was on her feet by noon, moving slow but moving, the child riding her hip in a fold of the blanket. She stood in the doorway looking out at the creek, where it ran black between white banks, and she asked George, quiet, how the water stayed open in a wind that had killed cattle 2 counties over. George said, "Warm ground under it." She looked at him and did not press. She had the sense not to. The man's name was Elmer Boyd, no kin to the freighter, he said quickly, seeing the flicker in George's eye. And he was bound for a brother's place east of the pass, with everything they owned strapped to the mare. He would not take the last of George's coffee without leaving a folded dollar under the tin cup, and George would not touch the dollar after they had gone, only set it inside the ledger between 2 pages as if it were a marker for a place he meant to keep. They left on the 4th day, with the mare rested, and the child bundled, and a sack of biscuit George had baked in the ash. Elmer said he would send word from his brothers, and he did. A week later, a boy from the Mercantile rode out the chapel road with a letter in his coat and a curious tilt to his head, and behind the letter, over the following days, came others. A cattle buyer from up the pass, hearing the story at a saloon 2 towns over, rode down to see the creek that had not frozen. A surveyor from the county seat came with a leather case and a level, and walked the pasture behind the shed for half a day, kneeling in the thin snow where the grass showed green through it. He measured and marked and shook his head, and finally sat on the doorstone with George and said, mild, "Mr. Walker, you've a warm spring under this whole bench. Runs the length of the pasture. That's why the creek holds. That's why the grass keeps." George said he had guessed as much. The surveyor tapped the ledger on the table and said, "Sam wrote it down plain. Somebody at the courthouse should have read this book years ago." George said, "Somebody read it now." Word carried the way word carries in a country that has little else to spend. Down in Pine Run, the 2 younger men who had laughed by the pickle barrel stopped laughing. The mercantile keeper counted George's coins once now, and slid the sack across the counter with a nod. The boys in the alley beside the livery no longer watched him ride in. They ran to hold Ash's bridle and would take no coin for it. On the porch of the Plank Saloon, the chorus that had jeered the $2 man in November stood quiet in February and lifted their hats when he passed. It was not spoken of directly. It did not need to be. A town that has laughed at a man and been proven wrong is a town that learns to keep its mouth shut and its eyes down until it can find the words. Boyd Harmon found them on a bright cold afternoon at the rail outside the land office. He was without the fine wool coat this time, only a plain sheepskin, and the heavy silver watch chain was tucked out of sight. He stood a moment before he spoke. He said, "Walker." George said, "Harmon." Harmon looked down the street and then back. He said, "I said some things in November." George waited. Harmon said, "I'd like to buy grain off you come fall. Fair price if you'll sell." George considered him. He said, "I'll sell you grain." Harmon nodded once, held out his hand, and George took it. Nothing else was said. Harmon walked back across to the freight yard, and the men on the saloon porch watched him go, and no one laughed at anyone that day. The old woman in the black shawl was on the mercantile porch when George came out with a sack of seed oats over his shoulder. She did not move from her place. She only lifted her chin at him and said soft, The ground remembers." George said, "Yes, ma'am. So do I." She smiled for the first time he had seen, small and closed, and folded her hands at her waist. And George rode north up the chapel road, with the oats behind the saddle, and ash steady under him, and the pines standing dark against a sky already going the color of a good coal. By late April the snow was gone from the bench, and the pasture behind the shed had come up green in a wide, slow wave, the way the ledger had promised it would. George set 4 new posts in the collapsed corral, and strung wire between them, and turned in the 6 young steers a neighbor 2 ridges over had let him take on shares. He raised the caved shed with new rafters cut from the windfall pine, and shook the roof with cedar split by his own hand. He rebuilt the plank ladder to the loft, and left the pale beam where Sam had set it, because it belonged there. He carried a flat creek stone up to the base of the tall pine at the cabin corner, laid it careful in the grass, and cut into its face with a chisel the letter S, and beside it the small mark of a horseshoe laid on its side, and under Anna's name a second horseshoe. And he set the stone so a man kneeling beside it could see the creek run past below. On an evening in the first true week of summer, when the light in the valley went from gold to amber to the color of honey held against a lamp, George stood at the cabin corner with his hand on the bark of the old pine and looked out over the pasture where the 6 steers grazed and the creek turned east, and ash cropped grass near the corral he had mended with his own rope and his own nails. His hands were split and healed and split again. His faded shirt was the same shirt. His boots were the same boots. He was not the same man. He thought of the herd he had lost, and the ranch he had lost, and the note folded once on the kitchen table he had not opened for 2 days. And he thought of the tin cup and the ledger and the child asleep against her mother by his hearth. The wind moved through the pine above him and did not hurry. He said, "Quiet," to no one, and to the ground, and to the 2 under the stone, "I didn't buy a place. I came home to one." Ash lifted his head at the sound of George's voice, held it a moment, and lowered it again to the grass. The light went from honey to blue. The creek ran on. Thank you for staying with George to the end of this one, for sitting through the loss and the $2 and the long, slow work of a man learning that what the world throws away can still be a home. If this story warmed something in you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so the next tale finds you by the fire. Another ride is waiting up the road.